So the reading that I'm presenting on is Anishinaabe Constitutional Order by Aaron Mills, Karen Drake, and Tanya Muthu Sempale. Within this reading, Mills seeks to provide the reader with an insight into the constitutional order that underlies Anishinaabe law rather than Anishinaabe law itself. And this is done because it is impossible to have an understood understanding of Anishinaabe law without first understanding the underlying constitutional order that gives rise to Anishinaabe law. And so, before Mills begins showing the Anishinaabe constitutional order, he defines the concept of a constitutional order. And when Mills is discussing constitutional order, he is referring to a framework for how people constitute themselves as a political community. And we can see from this definition that constitutional orders are thus grounded in a people's fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality, including their own ontology, cosmology, and epistemology. And so to show us how the Anishinaabe Constitutional Order operates, Mill splits this article into 5 sections. So first he examines the Anishinaabe epistemology. Second, he examines 3 adzudikanon, or stories which reflect an Anishinaabe constitutional order. Third, he explains the tree model of legality and compares Anishinaabe constitutional orders to a liberal constitutional order. Fourth, he provides a fact scenario depicting various legal issues affecting Anishinaabe community. And fifth and finally, he applies the constitutional order outlined in sections 2 and 3 to the fact scenario. So the first way we can see how Anishinaabe epistemology operates is to contrast it with Western epistemology and its conceptions about knowledge and truth. And so Mills first examines Western epistemology and points out that it is based on the conception of truth that is objective and absolute. And Mills states that true facts exist in the world independently of knowers and of the scientific method, and the scientific method is premised on this conception. For example, by repeatedly refining theories, we'll get ever closer to the truth. And Mills then goes on to state that we can contrast this with Anishinaabe conception of knowledge and truth, and we can see this through the story of Nanabozu and the maple trees. And he talks about this story as is told by Lana Ray and Paul Cromier. And in this story, when the world was new, Gitche Manitou made things so that life was easy for the people. And for example, there were plenty of animals, good weather, and the maple trees were filled with a thick, sweet syrup. And all people had to do was break off a twig and collect it as it dropped off. So then we get to the point of view of Nanabozu. And he went to go see his friends, the Anishinaabe, but when he arrived, there was nobody around, so he went looking for them, and when he finally found them, they were in a grove of maple trees laying on their backs with their mouths open, letting maple syrup drip into their mouths. And upon seeing this, Nanabuzi said that this will not do, and so he went down to the river and took a big basket made of birch bark and bring back many buckets of water and went to the top of the maple trees and poured the water in, so that it thinned out the syrup, making the syrup thin and watery and just barely sweet. And Nanabozu stated that when people want to make syrup, they will have to gather many buckets full of sap in birch bark baskets like his, and they will have to gather wood, fire, and make fires to heat the stones, to drop into the baskets to boil the water with the heated stones to make even a little bit of maple syrup. And so Ray and Cromier state that the thick maple syrup is akin to knowledge, and that Western teaching and learning methods, such as being spoon-fed facts from a PowerPoint slide, are the same as lying on the ground and letting maple syrup drip into your mouth, and that the process of turning the sap into syrup represents Anishinaabe knowledge. And this is because just as it takes as many people actively working together to gather buckets of sap, collecting wood, making a fire, boiling the sap, just to make a small amount of maple syrup, so too does learning require both sustained personal engagement as well as working together as part of a coordinated community, and this Anishinaabe epistemology corresponds to Anishinaabe conception of truth. So the next part Mills looks at within this article is the adzudikanon and the Anishinaabe constitutional order. And so Mills examines 3 adjudicanons, and these are stories. This is, I guess, the Anishinaabe way of saying that, which reflect the Anishinaabe constitutional order, which in turn gives rise to Anishinaabe legal processes and to Anishinaabe law. And so Mills also states that insofar as Anishinaabe adjudicon reflect constitutional and legal principles, it may be tempting to treat them as analogous to Canadian judicial decisions. However, these Anishinaabe stories differ from judicial decisions in at least 4 ways. And so the first one is that although Zudikanon reflects constitutional and legal principles, they are not authorities for law in the way that judicial decisions are authorities for common law principles. And here we can see that Zudikanon are not the sources of law. Rather, the source may be some interaction with the natural world or the actions of the community members, which gives rise to consensus regarding the principle at issue. Second, judicial decisions are meant to be fully comprehensible on a first reading. However, Zudikanon, in contrast, are often understood in a layered way, where the different layers of meaning within a story can provide guidance that varies from person to person, or even with the life of the same person, depending on life experiences at the time the story is heard. So essentially, stories do not embody objective absolute truths. Rather, they require a listener or a reader to be actively engaged and make meaning themselves. Third, and most importantly, is that case law abstracts from facts, and it intends that law should apply across all contexts, whereas Zudikanon present law as responsibilities, gifts, and reciprocal needs that vary across distinct kinds of relationships. And so the law that lives in an Anishinaabe story is specific to its relational context, and it can't be disembedded, generalized, and transplanted elsewhere. Fourth and finally is that in the Western system, judicial decisions are a narrow kind of reasoning which reflect a liberal conception of rationality, and working effectively with case law requires finely honed critical and analytical thinking skills. However, reasoning in the context of Anishinaabe law frequently makes demands upon one's whole self, body, mind, spirit, and heart. And here, reasoning has less to do with the anthropocentric forms of rationality and more to do with the provisions of reason. So Mills then moves on to examining the three Zudikanon, and he starts off with the vision of Kichi Manitou. And so in this story, it begins with a poem in which people ask the elders who gave each creature his or her gift. For example, who gave the rose of beauty, or who gave the rose the gift of beauty. And this poem gets held for later as the story begins by looking at the creation of the earth. So here, Kitch Manitou, the Great Spirit, had a vision of all things and dreamt of a sky, sun, and moon, mountains and forests, flowers, etc. And Kitch Manitou also saw the birth and end of things, and also experienced sadness and love within these things. And these experiences made Kitch Manitou realize that these experiences had to be brought into being. And one by one, Kitch Manitou brought the world into existence out of nothing, based on his experiences of these meanings. And so Kitch Manitou also gave every item in the world a unique power and nature. And last of all, Kitch Manitou created humankind. And humans were the least in the order of dependence, and were the weakest in bodily powers. But humanity had the greatest gift, which was the power to dream. And Kitch Manitou then made the great laws of nature for the well-being and harmony of all things and creatures. And these laws governed all of the activities of the natural world, including the place and movement of the sun and moon, earth, the stars, etc. And with this, Kitch Manitou's vision was brought into existence. And so Mills goes on to explain that this story reflects the tri-party structure of Anishinaabe constitutionalism, and the first constitutional feature revealed is interdependence. And so we can see that humans are not dominant over the world. Rather, humans were the last in the order of creation with the weakest bodily powers. And Mills states that if all animals and plants cease to exist, humans cannot survive, and because of this, we are most dependent on the natural world. But our relationship with the natural world is best described as interdependence because we need each other, and this is why we're given gifts to pass on. The second constitutional feature pertains to our gifts, and it's the logic of mutual aid. For example, Kitch Manitou conferred a special gift on each and every aspect of the natural world, including rocks, water, fire, and wind. And Mills states that there is a legal word for this sacred gifting in Anishinaabe called Minegozuin. And this refers to the fact that Kitch Manitou had gifted all of creation with what we need to have a good life together. And because of this, these are gifts that we don't own, and rather we borrow them and pass them on. And so essentially our gifts are not ours to profit from, rather we pass them on, and it's the connection developed from the constant flow of gifts and gift giving that coordinates interaction and sustains community cohesion, not the formal and detached bindingness of a social contract, as can be seen in the Western system. And so the third constitutional feature of this story is through harmony. And in this regard, the natural world in its natural state is not chaotic and lawless, and there is no state of nature in the sense of original disordered position from which we can escape by entering a social contract to create civil society where we impose human-made laws on each other, as Western ideologies would have you believe. And Mill states that, on the contrary, we could see that all aspects of the natural world are already imbued with law, and this would be through the great laws of nature, and are ordered, and these laws govern all aspects of the natural world, including human life, and when these laws are followed, the result is harmony. So then the next Adjudicanon Mills examines is the Great Law, and Mills states that he got this story from Randy Counselor's recollection of the story. And so this story begins with Rabbit, who we're told usually eats a wide variety of plants, and because of this, Rabbit does not overtax any one species of plant. However, one summer, the roses were especially delicious, and so Rabbit ate nothing but roses, and as a result, roses eventually became scarce, and as a result, the bee was unable to make as much honey as usual, and so the bee did not know the cause of the rose shortage and frequently lamented the problem to all of the other animals. However, the other animals lost patience with Bee's complaints and ignored him. But Hummingbird listened to Bee, and to determine the extent of the issue, he went on a search for roses. And after searching widely but finding no roses, Hummingbird and Bee called a great council of all the animals, and even at the Great Council, they didn't listen to Bee, and it was only until Bear realized and explained that the lack of roses meant that he would not have enough honey for the winter and would have to eat some other animals instead, that the animals started to listen. And so they started to listen because the other animals became concerned that they might be eaten by Bear or have to compete with Bear for food. And so as a result, the birds flew off in the 4 directions of the earth, in search of roses, and all were unsuccessful except for Hummingbird, who returned with a single half-dead rose. And the animals used all their combined knowledge to nurse the rose back to health. And once the rose was strong enough to talk, the animals asked what happened to the rose, and the rose explained that Rabbit had eaten all of the roses except for her. And as a result, Bear was so angry that he yanked the rabbit by the ears, and this is how rabbits got their stretched ears. And eventually Bear tossed the rabbit into an angry crowd and told them to kill the rabbit. However, the rose told them to stop and explained that all the animals were at fault as they failed to listen to the bee when the bee first told them about the issue. And Rose also stated that the animals had broken the greatest of all the great laws, and this one was the one that tells us that all living things must watch over all other living things and the Mother Earth. And following this, the Rose received thorns to keep them safe from rabbits. And so Mill states that this story again illustrates the tri-party structure of Anishinaabe constitutionalism. However, unlike the last story, this one identifies the 3 core constitutional features through the stacking errors of the animals in the story. And this story also introduces the democratic principle, which I'll be discussing shortly. So the first structural feature of Anishinaabe constitutionalism we can see is interdependence, and here each of the animals lost sight of the fact that they're in a relationship of interdependence with each other. For example, the rabbit failed to appreciate how his eating of all the roses would affect the bee's ability to make honey, which would affect the bear's diet, etc. The second structural feature of Anishinaabe constitutionalism that can be seen is mutual aid, and here the majority of the animals decline to render aid, opting out of the mutual aid framework, which involves a cycle of gifting, which generates gratitude, which in turn generates reciprocity, which further generates gift giving, and so on. And so when the animals initially ignored B, they withheld their gifts, which would help to meet the needs of all the other animals. And the third structural feature of Anishinaabe constitutionalism that can be seen is harmony. And here, when the animals opt out of the mutual aid framework, they were closing themselves off from one another. And the result is a sequence of calamities culminating in Rabbit's ears getting stretched and Ramit almost being killed. And we can see that harmony is finally restored when the animals are reminded of their responsibility to watch over each other, which can be fulfilled by rendering mutual aid. And Rabbit's stretched ears serve as an ongoing reminder of this responsibility. And Mills also states that the story illustrates the democratic principle, and by the democratic principle, Mills is referring to something closer to participatory democracy as opposed to representational democracy, And in this story, we can see this, for example, once a bee and hummingbird realized the extent of the problem, rather than trying to address it by themselves, they called a great council of all the animals, and each animal used its unique gift to contribute towards the solution. And we can see here that no animal was left out of the decision-making process. And so the final story the Mills examines is Beaver Gives a Feast. And here Beaver was the chief of the animals, and from time to time Beaver decided to give a feast where he'd invite all of the other animals. And at the feast, each time Beaver would pass the food on to his guests, he also passed wind, and this sent the silly otter into hysterics, and the other animals warned the otter not to laugh. However, he kept laughing. And finally, after being fed up, the other animals told the otter that he must not attend the next feast, and while the otter obliged, he told the others to ask Beaver to send him his share of the food in the size of the otter's forearm, which is very small. The others agreed and attended the next feast, where Beaver noticed that Otter was not among his guests and asked where Otter was because he liked him for his humor. The others told Beaver that Otter did not come, but asked Beaver to send him his share of the food, and so Beaver cut a piece to the size of the Otter's forearm and sent it back to the Otter. And so Mill states that this story further illustrates the democratic principle mentioned above, because we can see how authority works within an Anishinaabe political community here, namely through persuasive compliance. And so here, Beaver is the leader, but he does not exercise coercive authority or use force in a top-down way, as a Western sovereign does, in the form of the executive branch of the government. Instead, authority rests with the community members, and the community members have delegated the authority upwards to Beaver, or they don't delegate their authority upwards to Beaver and rather retain them themselves, and Beaver respects their decision as a result. So then Mills goes on to examine what he calls the tree model of legality, and we can see this under the Anishinaabe Constitutional Order heading. And so in the tree model, the roots of a society are its creation stories, and this is because these stories reveal to us what there is in the world, and this would be ontology and how we can know the world, and this would be through epistemology. And so creation stories disclose what a person is, what a community is, and what freedom looks like. So the next part of the tree is the trunk, which represents a constitutional order, and it's the structure generated by the roots, which organize and manifest these understandings of ontology and epistemology as a political community. And the next part of the tree is the branches, and these are legal traditions. And so the branches show a set of processes and institutions we engage to create, sustain, and make law. And the trunk conditions the branches, but it doesn't determine what they'll look like. However, it does powerfully shape how they look like. And so a constitutional order similarly settles which legal processes are legitimate within it, but without ever determining a necessary given set of processes as the illegitimate ones. And so Mill states that in this article they'll be focusing on the trunk, or the constitutional order. However, because in a liberal democracy the constitutional order is premised on the primacy of individual autonomy, individuals exercise their autonomy when they enter into social contracts in which they create rights and undertake obligations. However, the goal of entering a political community is to achieve a just state. However, in contrast, the ontological starting point of Anishinaabe constitutional order is not individual autonomy, but interdependence, and here all members of the political community are interdependent, and because of this, the political community sustains itself not through contract, but through mutual aid, and this leads to harmony, which is the ultimate goal, rather than a just state. And we could see the cycle of the Anishinaabe constitutional order here, where we start off with interdependence, and then we move on to mutual aid and harmony, and yeah, it goes in a cycle. So then Mills goes on to do a small fact scenario of a real-world case, and he believes that it's important because unless the judicial branch of government, he believes it's important to do this, especially when considering Anishinaabe constitutional orders, because unless the judicial branch of government is able to begin to understand and identify indigenous constitutionalism at work, it will continue to misread indigenous patterns of reason, argumentation, and action from a Canadian constitutional standpoint, and thus it will see indigenous actions in legal cases as disobedient or illegal. And so within this case, we're looking at the Anamiki Wikibunang First Nation, which are a Anishinaabe community located in northwestern Ontario, and they're a signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty. Recently, in 2016, a substantial deposit of chromite was discovered within their traditional territory, but outside their reserve. And so a mining company called Rocky Bay Mining Inc. has staked a number of claims in the area and wants to start the extraction process. And under the law, Section 35(1) of the the Constitution Act states that the Crown has a duty to consult with Aboriginal people wherever it contemplates action will have an adverse impact on Aboriginal or treaty rights, and it also has to provide accommodation in some circumstances. And so the case law also establishes that Indigenous law should form the interpretation of Section 35(1) and that Rocky Bay has to consult with the community under this law. And so in complying with the law, Rocky Bay held a consultation session at the First Nations Community Center at the start of August 2016, explaining the impacts of mining and the effects it would have on the land, and also the duration the mine will operate for. And after the presentation, Rocky Bay asked the nation for feedback by the end of September 2016, and the next month the community sent a letter to Rocky Bay in response to his presentation, and in it they asked that the proposed road that grants access to the mine should be moved 200 meters to avoid the maple trees. And they also asked to reduce the mine to a fifth of its proposed size so as to preserve the feeding grounds that are located on it. And they also explained that they needed more time before they can articulate their full response. And so in 2016, Rocky Bay sent the community a response which essentially said that they couldn't move the road and that they would give them 50 liters of maple syrup for the next 80 years that the mine would be operational for as accommodation, and that they couldn't resize the pit due to the shareholders of the company, but as a result they would give community members jobs, and that they couldn't wait for a full response to be articulated as they would be losing too much money as the response would be going into February 2017. And so Mills then conducts an analysis of how the Anishinaabe Constitutional Order informs this nation's decision-making process about the mining company's proposal. So essentially he just looks at some of the practices we discussed and how they would apply in this case, and he starts off by looking at interdependence, and here we can see that members of the First Nation are in a relationship of interdependence with maple trees and deer, and they're not property of any kind, and as such they're not resources or objects that the nation can make decisions for. And financial compensation not only fails to meet the broader needs at issue, but is also destructive towards the existing mutual aid relationships between the nation and the maple trees and deer. And so the next constitutional principle Mills discusses in mutual aid, and in this case we can see that if Rocky Bay wants to operate within the consent of the nation, it is in its traditional territory, it will have to find a way to enter into political community with the nation, and it can do this by identifying the needs of the nation and then offering the gifts it has to share that would meet those needs. And at this point, Rocky Bay has identified some gifts that it can offer, such as maple syrup, jobs, and monetary payment, but it's not clear if each of these gifts accurately corresponds to a need of the nation. The next constitutional principle Mills discussed is harmony, and with respect to harmony, Mills states that this would relate to the size of the mine, and here the nation is concerned with taking only what is needed, and after considering the needs of the maple trees and the feeding grounds for the deer, the nation concludes that the mine should be reduced to a fifth of the proposed size. However, Rocky Bay's determinant for an appropriately sized mine was maximizing shareholder profits, and we can see that these two determinants not only fail to align but also pull against each other. And the final constitutional principle Mills discusses is the democratic principle. And here the nation has a responsibility to consult with all community members affected by the proposed action, including the maple trees and the deers and the rock, etc. That will be removed in order to dig the mine. And the nation also needs more time to consult with their off-reserve members. However, Rocky Bay wants the nation's chief to make a unilateral decision based on the authority granted to the chief and council under the Indian Act, and we can see that this request by Rocky Bay directly contravenes the principle that authority rests in community. In the community who is responsible for the decision-making that affects community governance. And so that's the end of the presentation, and then I would have moved on to my discussion questions, but I guess the class got canceled. So overall, this was, I guess, a really interesting reading, and it provided a lot of information, and I'm glad I got to present on it. So yeah, thank you.